I'm very honored, John, and I'm so grateful for the honor of being here to address the distinguished graduates this morning. Congratulations to all of you and to the families sitting back there whose love and support helped make all that these men and women have achieved possible. Graduates, please join me in thanking your families. Don't go quite as far back as the chairman, but I've been a college or university student or faculty member for nearly 40 years. As a matter of fact, John, my father, my dear beloved father, World War II veteran, fought at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient in the Normandy campaign, is wondering when I'm going to get a job. He sent me off to kindergarten one day and I never left school. As a result of that, I have attended, as you can imagine, many commencement ceremonies. But you know, they are never old hat to me. It is always uplifting and really truly inspiring to celebrate classroom accomplishment and to send the graduates out into the world or back out into the world to put the knowledge and skills they have acquired to work in their chosen fields and in good causes. I've seen so many students go on to do truly remarkable things with their lives. It's always been one of my greatest joys to see just how far graduates can go in life, especially when they have a deep and abiding sense of what President Lenczowski called mission, that sense of purpose propelling them forward. And I've noticed that men and women are more likely to have such a sense of mission and purpose when a sense of mission and purpose is actually embedded in the school they've attended. And there's no question that all of you are graduating from an institution whose mission and purpose has shaped every aspect of the education you have received. This has been not simply education for you, but formation, training of the mind, of the heart, of the conscience, of the character. The Institute for World Politics is an institution where values and virtues truly matter. Across the country at commencement ceremonies, at colleges and universities, speakers will talk about how at this or that institution values and virtues really matter. But do they? Looking out at the academic environment today, do they? Well, they do at the Institute for World Politics. This is a place where serious thought and reflection influence both personal character and the way people view national security, foreign policy, and intelligence. The education you have received here rests on two pillars. First, a firm faith in the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of every member of the human family. Second, and President Lenczowski reminded us again today of this idea, this principle, this truth, a sober acknowledgement of the flaws in human nature and the realities of the human condition. Flaws and realities that truly did motivate James Madison and the other founders to create the kind of republic, the kind of constitutional regime that they bequeathed to us. If you have a look again, as I'm sure you have on more than one occasion, at Federalist Paper number 10, there you will see Madison talking about the importance of designing a government that is in line with a realistic understanding of human nature. To speak of the matter in biblical terms, one of the great paradoxes, perhaps the great paradox of humanity, is that we are, and all of us are, in one sense, mere dust of the earth, and yet in another sense, made in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of the universe, a little less than the angels. These two pillars of which I speak, put into place by President Lenczowski when he founded the Institute in 1990, 25 years ago, have enabled the Institute to produce what I call humanitarian realists, men and women who think critically and clearly about national security and international order, and who avoid falling prey either to utopianism, which is disastrous, or cynicism, which is catastrophic. In the dangerous world in which we live today, in particular in the dangerous world in which we live today, our beloved nation needs men and women of this sort, humanitarian realists, people who reject both utopianism and cynicism more than we ever have. We need you. As we celebrate the Institute's 25 years of service to the nation and to the cause of learning, it's worth recalling the year of its founding, that momentous year. In the preceding months and couple of years, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and what had come to be known as the Iron Curtain had been rent. By 1990, the once seemingly invincible, hard to think of it today, I remember it from my boyhood, the thought that the Soviet Union was invincible. But by 1990, it was in its death throes. Back then, we were witnessing the greatest triumph of freedom since the defeat of the Axis powers in the Second World War. Our triumph in the Cold War was made possible in part by an often overlooked factor, that is, the pivotal role of religion, particularly as embodied in the leadership of Pope John Paul II, as friend and ally and apostle of freedom. So today I want to focus my remarks about the relationship, on the relationship between religion and freedom, and especially religious freedom and its critical importance in our dealings with other countries. Now, I'm bound to say that I do not on this occasion speak on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where I currently serve as vice chairman and have served as chairman, but my remarks will certainly reflect my experience on the commission. I address all of you as current or future architects or custodians of our foreign policy, our national security, and our intelligence services. I can say with certainty that in your work, perhaps some of you the work you're doing even now, but certainly the work all of you will be doing, you will be facing issues involving religion and freedom. The so-called secularization thesis that was dominant in academic circles for more than 2 decades, the idea that religion would simply wither away, at least its significance would wither away, under the pressure of modernity, so that we would no longer have to concern ourselves with religion in matters of public and international affairs, that thesis has been decisively falsified. Nobody believes it anymore. In fact, looking at the realities of the world, how could anyone believe it? The more interesting question is, how did anyone believe it? But they did believe it, and it's now gone. Religion is here, and it's here to stay. And whatever their personal beliefs about spiritual matters, policymakers and those who execute our nation's policies will have to deal with it. So let's begin by talking about religion itself. According to a recent Pew poll, fully 84% of the world's population identifies with a specific religious group. In other words, for the vast majority of people across the globe, religion matters at some level. For some, it matters very, very deeply. And for many, religion is not just one of several affiliations or identity shapers. It's a major affiliation and source of identity. There's no getting around it. From worship to prayer, births to funerals, weddings to holy days, almsgiving to thanksgiving, religion remains a powerful source of identity, of meaning, of purpose for billions of our fellow human beings, as it does for tens or hundreds of millions of our fellow citizens. And this is often true at all levels, from the grassroots to the highest positions in governments and societies. And yet for generations, this simple fact seems somehow to elude, confound, astonish foreign policy experts in Western democracies, including our own. Time and again, so many experts seemed like the proverbial deer in the headlights when confronting some of the major events of our time because they were clearly driven by or shaped by religion. I well recall the shock and disbelief which followed the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1978 and his replacement by the radical theocratic regime of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Despite many indicators that Khomeini's movement had been on the rise, was gaining power. Foreign policy elites seemed simply astonished. Nearly a decade later, even a decade later, even having had the experience of Khomeini, about religion's role in the stunningly rapid succession of events in Central and Eastern Europe, culminating in the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, one day after Christmas. When Pope John Paul II first stood up to Soviet tyranny in the early 1980s, few people in the foreign policy, national security, or intelligence fields ever imagined how powerful his actions would be, how powerfully they would affect unfolding events, how powerfully religion-based freedom movements across the Soviet Empire would grow, helping to destroy the dictatorial reign of the Soviet tyrants. Now, of course, it's equally clear how the brutal reality behind 9/11 confounded the experts as 19 hijackers killed 3,000 Americans and themselves for no reason other than a belief that somehow they were pleasing God. But today, everyone agrees that the terrible rampages of the Islamic State, Boko Haram, and the like-minded terrorist groups remain utterly inexplicable unless we understand the religious or at least quasi-religious motivations of the terrorists. And so, at long last, perhaps we are seeing signs of a growing understanding of what should have been obvious to everyone. You cannot conduct foreign policy with the rest of the world if you are clueless or dismissive about religion's pivotal role in so many parts of the world. You cannot have a successful national security or intelligence strategy if you are clueless or dismissive about the religious motivations of your adversaries. In other words, whether in the cause of good or evil, religion matters greatly across the globe, and truly we ignore it or remain ignorant of it at our peril. And because religion matters to humanity, so must freedom of religion. Simply stated, people want, at least for themselves, sometimes not so much for others, the freedom to practice their faith as they see fit. Yet while religion remains something that matters to 84% of the world's population, something like 75%, 3/4 of the world's population, live in countries where freedom of religion is routinely, seriously violated, either by governments or by non-state actors, including the forces of terrorism, that governments either will not or cannot control. These violations range from limitations on worship or the building of houses of worship, all the way to imprisonment, torture, and even murder. Since the very freedom that billions of people most want is being restricted, such restrictions set the stage for strife and instability across much of the world. And that alone should put religious freedom on the radar screen of every foreign policy, national security, and intelligence professional in our country. If we're to have a foreign policy, a national security agenda, an intelligence strategy that are attuned to the actual role of religion in people's lives, we need to put religious freedom at the heart of things in planning our nation's way forward in the field of international affairs. That doesn't mean that freedom of religion trumps or displaces the very legitimate concerns we have in the economic domain with trade and so forth, or in the military and geostrategic domains. But religion and religious freedom must have a place at the table. But in order to do that, we're going to have to educate ourselves on what freedom of religion truly is. Now, of course, it's a cherished value here in the United States, one that has constitutional standing for us. We're having certain domestic politics disputes about what it actually means and where and how it applies and how to balance it with competing concerns. Yet we're committed to it while at the same time so often misunderstanding it, at least when it comes to our elites and foreign policy professionals, because we conceive it too narrowly. It's far broader, more inclusive, and more sweeping in scope than many realize. It centrally includes, it's very important to understand that it centrally includes, not only the freedom to worship, but going beyond what goes on in the home or the church or the synagogue or the mosque of the temple or the temple, it's the right within the broad limits of justice and the common good, respect for the freedom of others, to live one's life with authenticity and integrity in light of one's judgments of conscience as to one's moral and spiritual obligations. Contrary to what some people seem to think, promoting religious freedom does not mean imposing values on other people. Quite the contrary. It's about protecting everyone's right peacefully to worship God or not, as he or she sees fit, and to fulfill what one conscientiously believes to be one's religious duties. We want that for ourselves. We should want it for others. Religious freedom applies to the holders of all religious beliefs, bar none. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom fights diligently for the religious freedom of people of every faith, from A to Z, from Anglicans to Zoroastrians. We stand up for anyone, anywhere, whose rights peacefully to practice and live by their faith are denied or placed in jeopardy, be they Muslims or Christians, Jews or Buddhists, Hindus, Baha'is, Sikhs, Yazidis, Taoists, Falun Gong. But religious freedom is even broader than that. Not only does it apply to those who hold religious beliefs, it also extends to those who reject religious beliefs altogether. When atheists or agnostics are targeted or punished for expressing their convictions, as they are in some places in the world, or when they are compelled to pretend to a faith that they do not hold, they too merit support and protection. Religious freedom, in other words, is not a right held exclusively by the religious. It's a genuine and universal human right. If you're a human, you've got it. Your government may not respect it. Your government may let others freely dishonor it, but they do wrong. Governments do wrong when they do that, because it is your right as a human being. The right of religious liberty knows no geographical or national boundaries. It's not the exclusive preserve of any one country, nor is any country excused from honoring the religious liberty of its own people or people residing within its borders. To insist that all nations, which we should insist, that all nations honor the religious liberty of their people, is not a form of cultural imperialism. For religious freedom is not a local custom, it's not an American peculiarity, rather it's a universal value. Indeed, most nations have recognized this moral fact by endorsing Article 18 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as subsequent international agreements. And finally, the basic right to religious freedom is important enough to merit a seat at the table with economics and security concerns in the formation of our own nation's foreign policies, I mentioned earlier. Our interests cannot be separated from our values, and the commitment to religious freedom is as central a value to our national self-understanding as there is. Remember, we as a nation are committed to the proposition that all men, not just all Americans, all human beings, are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. We are believers in human rights, natural rights, rights that people possess not by virtue of their citizenship or residency, but simply by virtue of their humanity. Religious freedom is among these fundamental rights. Standing up for it where we can is simply a matter of being true to ourselves. Now, thus far, I've talked about how and why religion matters or should matter in our foreign policy and national security and intelligence strategy. We've explored how this naturally leads to defending religious freedom, and we've talked about how a broad and deep religious freedom serves the interests of all. The next question is why religious freedom must matter as well. I've alluded to part of the answer by noting that billions of people care about religion. So denying or restricting their freedom to practice the faith they believe in and live by it, whether a regime or organization's motive for persecuting people for their beliefs is itself religious or secular, and it can be either one. Religious freedom is denied in the name of secularism, and religious freedom is denied in the name of religion. But denying it either way is a sure step for an unstable and even dangerous world. Numerous scholarly investigations and studies have borne this out. Countries that protect religious liberty are more secure than those that do not. And nations that trample on this freedom provide fertile ground for poverty, terror, and radical movements. Religious freedom abuses do grave harm to the well-being of societies. They do so politically, as religious freedom abuses are highly correlated with the absence of democracy and the presence of other human rights abuses. They do so economically, as religious persecution destabilizes communities and marginalizes the persecuted, causing their talents and abilities to go unrealized, robbing a nation of added productivity and reducing that nation's ability to fight poverty and create abundance for its citizens. They do so morally, since wherever religious freedom is dishonored, the benefit of religion in molding character is diminished, and with it the self-discipline necessary to handle the rights and responsibilities of free citizens. And they do so socially, since wherever religious freedom is abused, peace and security become ever more elusive. For the United States, all of this has a direct bearing, not simply an indirect bearing, a direct bearing on our own security. Just consider, for example, of the 4 countries that hosted Osama bin Laden during his notorious life, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Pakistan, each is an incubator of terrorism in the form of violent religious extremism, and all have consistently perpetrated or tolerated, repeated, egregious, systematic religious freedom violations. And as we all know, the 9/11 attacks were plotted in Afghanistan, which was run by the Taliban, which originated in Pakistan, with 15 of the 19 attackers coming from Saudi Arabia. But let's go still deeper. If you think about it, religious freedom means nothing less than the right to be who we are as human beings. The fact is that as rational creatures, we are drawn to ponder life's deepest questions and seek meaningful, truthful answers. Even the most intelligent of the brute beasts, as far as we know, don't do that. Dolphins or chimpanzees or elephants. We human beings ask, in all times, in all places, in all cultures. We're drawn to ask because we're rational creatures. Where do we come from? What is our destiny? Is there some transcendent, more than merely material or human source of meaning and value? Or is this all there is? Is there a higher law that pulls us above personal, individual self-interest and calls us to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us? Now, no matter how these questions are answered, whether they lead the inquirer to a theistic conclusion or a non-theistic form of a religious conclusion or to atheism, one thing is indisputable. Human beings cannot stop asking these questions And we would be diminished precisely as human beings if we were to try to stop asking these questions, seeking answers to them. And that suggests that the religious quest is a constitutive part of our very humanity, an aspect of our flourishing, our well-being as the kind of creatures we are, namely rational, intelligent, free actors. And this in turn suggests that we must cherish and honor, preserve and protect the right of persons to ask and answer these questions as best they can. And again, within the broadest limits of concern for the freedom and rights of others, justice and the common good, recognizing the right of people to lead their lives with authenticity and integrity in line with their best judgments of conscience. And so both as individuals and together with others in community, religious freedom must include the right to ponder life's origins and not just have a view imposed. The right to ponder life's meaning and purpose, to explore the deepest questions about human nature, dignity, and destiny, to decide what is to be believed and not to be believed without the threat of force, coercion, compulsion, and again within the limits of justice for all, to comply with what one conscientiously judges to be one's religious obligations, openly, peacefully, and without fear. The great 19th century theologian John Henry Newman, who became a cardinal of the Catholic Church after his conversion from Anglicanism, once observed, and I quote him, that conscience has rights because it has duties. Conscience isn't just the permissions department. It's not in the business of just writing permission slips to do what you want. On the contrary, conscience has rights because it has duties. Conscience, Newman said, is a stern monitor. Our recognition, not that we have the moral freedom to do as we please, but that we have the moral obligation to do what's right. And we honor the rights of conscience in matters of faith because people must be free to lead lives of authenticity and integrity by fulfilling what they believe in conscience to be their solemn duties. But authenticity and integrity are directly threatened whenever there is compulsion or coercion in matters of faith and belief. Indeed, coercion does not produce, it cannot produce, it never produces, it never will produce genuine conviction. Coercion can't do that. It can only produce pretense and lack of authenticity. It's because faith is by its nature free. You can compel, a state can compel, a terrorist organization or a group of hoodlums or thugs can compel the outward manifestations of faith. Going to church, saying your prayers, but they cannot reach the inward acts of intellect and will that are the very essence of faith itself. A coerced faith, in other words, whatever it is not faith. Compulsion may do no more than cause outward manifestations of belief or unbelief. Therefore, it is essential that freedom of religion include the right to hold any belief or none at all, that it include, and this is very important for you going forward in your careers in diplomacy and international relations, it must include the right of every human being to change his or her beliefs, to leave a religion, to enter a different religion, the right to change one's mind in light of one's best judgments of conscience. And it must include the right to bear witness to one's beliefs in public as well as private and corporately in the form of churches or other religious communities as well as individually, and to act as Dr. Martin Luther King famously and rightly acted on religiously inspired convictions about justice and the common good in carrying out the duties of democratic citizenship. Well, we've explored now how and why religion and religious freedom matters. matter, and why both should be on your radar screen in the coming years as you move forward in your careers. And all this leads to an obvious question. What is being done today about these issues worldwide? Well, in 1998, when Congress passed and President Clinton signed into law the International Religious Freedom Act, the IRFA, which created the Commission on Religious Freedom, and with it a Religious Freedom Office in the State Department, headed by a Religious Freedom Ambassador at Large, currently the distinguished Rabbi David Saperstein. The act charged us not only with monitoring religious freedom overseas, but with making concrete recommendations to the Congress, to the Secretary of State, and to the President. That's what the Commission on Religious Freedom is supposed to do. Most of our recommendations focus on how the United States can encourage other countries to improve their religious freedom records. But Congress and the IRFA, the Act, also gave the law some real teeth through a groundbreaking enforcement mechanism. It required annual review and designation of certain countries, the worst religious freedom abusers, those guilty of systematic, ongoing, egregious violations of religious liberty, their designation as CPCs, countries of particular concern. By definition, the world's worst religious freedom abusers. Measuring each nation against the CPC standard, our Commission's job is to recommend, based on its reviews, which countries the State Department should designate as CPCs. And once the State Department has made a designation, the IRFA law allows for diplomatic steps to be taken and or sanctions to be imposed on such nations. Indeed, it calls for those steps. Now, while the law provides any particular administration with flexibility, certain flexibility as to what the steps will be, the review and the designation process is not discretionary. The law of the United States requires it. The IRFA law requires every administration, Republican or Democrat, to engage fully in the task of designating countries based on the systematic, careful review of their records on religious freedom. Whatever one's view of appropriate penalties for violators, there can be no disagreement on the imperative of bearing witness to abuses. So at a minimum, it's our job to call the nation's attention and the attention of policymakers for the nation to egregious violations of religious freedom so that they can be taken into account in our diplomatic dealings and in our foreign policy concerning those nations. And that's what the designation at a minimum is supposed to do. Unfortunately, neither Republican nor Democratic administrations have consistently designated countries that meet the standards for CPC status. The result is that some of the world's worst violators, such as Pakistan and Vietnam, are escaping accountability. But there's more. Even those countries which are currently designated as CPCs are escaping accountability on the sanctions end. Under the law, while CPC countries remain designated until being removed from that status, any corresponding penalties on these nations expire after 2 years. In September of 2013, when the current administration failed to take action, the IRFA-related sanctions attached to Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, and Sudan expired. And while these countries are subject to sanctions under other U.S. laws, allowing the religious freedom sanctions to expire sends exactly the wrong message, indeed a disturbing message, a message that the United States will not implement its own law on religious freedom. It's the opposite of the message that we need to be sending, given the importance of religious freedom to the welfare of people around the world and to international security and stability. So clearly it's time for the executive branch to take its own IRFA obligations seriously by making designations and doing so in a timely manner. This should be our message to future administrations of whatever party. This is not a partisan question. The failings have not all been on one party or the other. Both parties need to take responsibility for implementing the law of the land as enacted by Congress. Doing so, by the way, will make a difference. It's worth doing not simply because it's the law, though that would be a sufficient reason, we're a nation of laws, but because the law is a law when implemented, which when implemented can make a difference for people around the world and for international order. When combined with diplomacy and other tools, the prospect and reality of being designated as a CPC and being sanctioned can move at least some repressive governments to make changes. In the past, we've seen that happen with countries like Vietnam and Turkmenistan. Vietnam is a kind of interesting case. They were designated as CPCs. Interestingly, they almost immediately began taking steps to mitigate their own religious freedom abuses with a view to being taken off the CPC list, not wanting the diplomatic steps and sanctions to be taken pursuant to the law. Then we, as a nation, too early, too quickly, precipitously, perhaps with a view to encouraging more good behavior, removed them from the list. What happened? They backslid, went right back to their old ways, and yet have not been redesignated. So we know, not in every case, it's not going to work with North Korea, but we know that there are some cases, I believe many cases, in which CPC designation can make a difference to the lives of people who are oppressed and persecuted. We can help. And let me add that I commend the State Department for finally designating Turkmenistan as a CPC last year. Because a CPC designation is rightly perceived as a statement by the United States about its relationship to an offending nation, it can create political will for reform where none would otherwise exist, while strengthening the hand of reformers. It can help the forces inside a country badly in need of reform, an Iran, a Saudi Arabia. It can help the forces inside to make some progress. I want to make a final appeal to those who are graduating today, to the men and women sitting right up here in front of us. As you embark on or move ahead in your career, whether it's in foreign policy or homeland security or intelligence or diplomacy or in the academy, pay careful heed to religion and religious freedom. Do not repeat the mistake of a couple of generations of elites in foreign policy. Keep your eyes and ears open to the old biases that downplay or deny the role of religion, and whenever possible, please don't hesitate to really challenge the myopia that drives that idea that religion is just epiphenomenal or religion doesn't matter, or there must be some deeper causes. Sometimes there are other causes. Sometimes religion is just layered on to motivations that are fundamentally tribal or ideological or economic. But we also know that very often religion is a motivator. We of all people, at this time in our nation's history, know that. So let's not fall back into the old ways. Let's understand religion. Let's be alert to its role. Let's press for religious freedom when we can because of its good effects in liberating people, precious human beings made in the image and likeness of God, and in advancing our own interest and the world's interest in international peace and security. Well, as President Lenczowski said, you have been shaped in an institution that cares about virtue and values, that cares about character, that has sought to help you become persons of moral conscience as well as persons of high intellect. My prayer for you is that you will stay faithful to what you've learned here at the Institute, that you will remain cognizant of the need to maintain the careful blend of idealism and realism that has been the hallmark of your education here. If you do that, you'll make a real difference in the world. The American founders described what they gave us, this constitutional republic, as an experiment, the American experiment in ordered liberty. Why did they call it an experiment? They called it an experiment because they knew there was no guarantee of success. In fact, republics, when they had been tried throughout human history, going back to the ancient world or the medieval and Renaissance city-states, where republicanism had been tried, it had been failed. Many had drawn the conclusion that the best that we could hope for, the best that freedom-loving people could hope for, was mild as opposed to tyrannical authoritarianism. The founders wanted to show the world that Republican democracy could work if structured in a way, if designed in a way that took into account the realities of human nature. We've tried the experiment. So far, we've been able to maintain it. But this is an experiment that will never finally be proven. It falls to each new generation to keep it going. We pray that the day will never come when a generation, because of ignorance or inattentiveness or ill will, fails to carry the experiment in Republican government, the experiment in ordered liberty, forward. So, as Lincoln said, with faith in God, with faith in the right as God has seen us, has shown us the right, we go forward in the hope that we will be able to do our part in sustaining this experiment in ordered liberty, even as the God who saved us through a revolution and through a civil war does his part. Congratulations to all of you, and may God bless you going forward. Thank you.